Marcus Thornton had walked into Celestine's restaurant 1,000 times over the past 15 years, always expecting the same refined atmosphere, the same impeccable service, the same predictable evening that would end with a signed contract or a successful business dinner that pushed his real estate empire forward another calculated step. But tonight something shattered that expectation so completely that he found himself frozen 3 steps past the mahogany host stand, his Italian leather briefcase slipping from his fingers and hitting the marble floor with a sound that made several nearby diners turn their heads in mild curiosity. The restaurant manager, Pierre, immediately moved toward him with concern etched across his professionally pleasant features, clearly worried that their most valued regular customer was having some kind of medical episode right there in the entrance. But Marcus barely registered the man's approach, because every cell in his body was focused on the young woman across the dining room, the waitress in the simple black uniform who was leaning over table 12 to refill water glasses, completely unaware that she was wearing something that had been stolen from his family's estate 32 years ago during a burglary that had never been solved, and had broken his mother's heart so thoroughly that she'd never been quite the same afterward. The necklace caught the low amber light from the chandelier overhead, its distinctive pattern of interlocking sapphires and diamonds creating that unmistakable constellation design that Marcus had seen in family photographs since childhood. The piece that had belonged to his grandmother Evelyn then passed to his mother Catherine, a necklace that was supposed to have been his inheritance to give to his own daughter someday, but instead had vanished on an October night in 1992, along with several other pieces of jewelry that the insurance had covered, but could never truly replace. His heart was hammering against his ribs like it was trying to escape his chest. His carefully controlled breathing pattern that he'd learned in executive stress management courses completely abandoned as he stood there drawing in sharp gasps that made his throat tight, because this wasn't possible, this couldn't be happening, yet there it was, draped around the neck of a girl who couldn't have been more than 25 years old, someone who probably didn't have any idea what she was wearing, or what it meant or how its presence here, in this moment, was about to change everything for both of them. Pierre had reached him now, one hand extended cautiously toward his elbow, asking in hushed, concerned tones if Miss Thornton needed to sit down, if perhaps they should call someone, if there was anything wrong, and Marcus managed to shake his head and hold up one hand in a gesture that was meant to convey that he was fine even though he absolutely was not fine, his eyes never leaving that necklace as the waitress straightened up and moved toward the kitchen, the piece swaying slightly against her collarbone with each step she took. 20 minutes later, Marcus found himself seated at his usual corner table, though he'd barely tasted the wine that Pierre had poured with shaking hands after Marcus had insisted everything was perfectly all right, just a momentary dizzy spell, nothing to worry about. Please don't make a fuss. And now he was pretending to study the menu he'd memorized years ago while actually watching that waitress move through her section with an efficiency that spoke of someone who'd been doing this work long enough to have it down to a science. She had dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, olive skin that suggested Mediterranean heritage perhaps, and a face that would have been quite pretty if it wasn't marked by the kind of exhaustion that comes from working too many double shifts and sleeping too few hours, the sort of weariness that Marcus recognized from his early days building his business when he'd functioned on ambition and coffee, and sheer stubborn determination. She moved between tables with practiced grace, her smile professional but genuine when she spoke to customers, her hands steady as she balanced trays and cleared plates and navigated the complicated social choreography of high-end restaurant service, and through it all, that necklace rested against her throat like it belonged there, like it had always been, an impossibility that Marcus couldn't stop staring at even though he knew he should be more subtle, should be maintaining the composed exterior that had made him successful in business, and feared in boardrooms across 3 states. His phone buzzed in his jacket pocket, undoubtedly his assistant Jennifer confirming tomorrow's meetings or his daughter Sophia asking if he'd remembered to pick up her dry cleaning, but he ignored it, ignored everything except the problem unfolding before him, the mystery that needed solving, because that necklace represented more than just monetary value or even sentimental attachment. It represented the night his mother had wept in his father's arms, while police officers took statements and insurance adjusters made notes, and young Marcus had promised himself that someday, somehow, he would find the people responsible and make them pay for what they'd taken. The waitress was approaching his table now, order pad in hand, that professional smile firmly in place, and Marcus realized with a start that he was about to speak to her, was about to begin a conversation that would either solve a decades-old mystery or reveal him to be a complete fool chasing shadows and coincidences, but he couldn't look away from that necklace, couldn't stop his mind from cataloging every detail to compare against the photographs he'd studied so many times over the years, the distinctive asymmetrical setting, the way the largest sapphire sat slightly off-center, the delicate gold filigree work that connected each stone, all of it exactly as he remembered, exactly as it had been the last time his mother had worn it to a charity gala 3 weeks before it disappeared forever. Maya Santos had been working at Celestine's for 18 months, and had learned to read customers the way her abuela used to read tea leaves, predicting their moods and needs and likely tip percentages within the first 30 seconds of approaching their table, so when she walked up to the distinguished man at table 7, she immediately catalogued the details that told her this was going to be either very good or very bad with no comfortable middle ground between them. He was in his 50 expensive suit that probably cost more than she made in 3 months. Steel grey hair styled in that casual but calculated way that wealthy men seem to prefer, and eyes that were currently fixed on her throat with an intensity that made her hand drift automatically to her necklace in a protective gesture she'd developed over the past few weeks since she'd started wearing it. The man seemed to realize he was staring because he blinked rapidly and looked down at his menu, then back up at her with an expression that was trying for casual interest but landing somewhere closer to barely controlled panic, which was unusual because men who wore suits that expensive usually had their emotions locked down tighter than their stock portfolios. Maya clicked her pen and prepared to recite the evening specials, her well-practiced script already forming on her lip, but before she could speak the man cleared his throat and asked in a voice that was rougher than she'd expected, whether she would mind answering a personal question, which immediately set off warning bells in her head because personal questions from male customers rarely led anywhere good. She took a small step back, her professional smile cooling by several degrees, and told him that depended on the question, her tone polite but firm, the voice she used when establishing boundaries with patrons who'd had one too many glasses of wine. But the man didn't seem to notice her defensive posture, because he was leaning forward now, his knuckles white where they gripped the edge of the table, asking her where she'd gotten that necklace. Those exact words, "Where did you get that necklace?" with an urgency that seemed wildly disproportionate to the question. Maya's hand closed around the pendant protectively, her fingers covering the sapphires that had belonged to her grandmother Elena, the one piece of real jewelry she owned, the only valuable thing she'd inherited when her abuela had passed away 8 months ago, and she found herself backing up another step while saying it was a family heirloom. None of his business really, and did he want to hear the specials or did he need another minute with the menu? The man's face did something complicated, emotions flickering across his features too quickly for her to identify them all, and then he was standing up, not aggressive but sudden enough that Maya's hand went to the panic button disguised as a pager on her belt. The one that would bring Pierre and 2 security guards within 30 seconds if she pressed it, but the man held both hands up in a gesture of surrender, or maybe appeal, and started speaking quickly, words tumbling over each other like he was afraid she'd walk away before he could finish, telling her that he wasn't trying to frighten her, but that necklace was stolen from his family over 30 years ago, that it had belonged to his mother, that he'd recognize it anywhere, and could she please just tell him how she came to have it, because this was impossible but it was real and he needed to understand. Maya felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her feet, the restaurant sounds fading to a distant buzz as she processed what this stranger was saying, because her grandmother had owned that necklace for as long as Maya could remember, had worn it to every important family occasion, had pressed it into Maya's hands 3 days before she died, and told her to never sell it, no matter how desperate things got, that it was worth more than money, worth more than Maya could understand. She heard herself saying that was impossible. Her grandmother had owned this necklace since before Maya was born, bought it at an estate sale in Brooklyn in the late 80s, paid $12 for it because the seller didn't know what they thought it was costume jewelry, and her abuela had laughed about that bargain for 30 years. The man was shaking his head now, pulling out his phone with trembling fingers, swiping through photos with the kind of frantic energy that suggested he was either telling the truth or the most committed liar Maya had ever encountered, and then he was turning the screen toward her, showing her a photograph of an elegant woman in her 50s wearing the exact necklace that currently hung around Maya's throat, the image clearly from the early 90s based on the hairstyle and the quality of the photo. Maya leaned in despite her professional distance crumbling as she looked at the woman in the picture, at the necklace that was unmistakably identical to the one she wore, at the date stamp in the corner that read September, and felt a cold understanding starting to seep into her bones like ice water through cracked stone. The man was talking again, showing her more photos, older ones in black and white of another woman wearing the same necklace, then newspaper clippings about a burglary, police report, insurance documents, all of it on his phone like he'd been carrying this evidence around waiting for this exact moment. And Maya realized with a sinking feeling that settled in her stomach like lead that either this man was elaborately scamming her for reasons she couldn't begin to understand, or her beloved grandmother, the woman who'd raised her after her parents died, who'd taught her to cook and pray and stand up straight, had somehow come into possession of stolen property and never known it, or worse, had known it and never said anything. Pierre appeared at her elbow, asking if everything was all right in that tone that meant he'd noticed the unusual interaction and was prepared to intervene. And Maya found herself looking from the manager to the customer to the phone screen, still showing evidence of a 32-year-old crime, her mind racing through implications and possibilities while her hand stayed locked around the necklace like she could protect it, or protect her grandmother's memory, or protect herself from whatever was about to happen. They ended up in Pierre's office. 45 minutes later, Maya's section covered by another server, and Marcus having texted his daughter that he'd be late getting home without explaining why, because how could he possibly explain this? And now the necklace lay on a white cloth napkin on Pierre's cluttered desk, between them like evidence at a crime scene, which Maya supposed it technically was. Marcus had brought up more photos on his laptop, images he'd apparently been carrying in a cloud folder for years, just in case, which seemed both prepared and slightly obsessive in a way that made Maya wonder exactly what kind of man sat across from her in Pierre's second-hand office chair that squeaked whenever he shifted his weight. The oldest photograph showed a woman in 1940s dress, wearing the necklace, at what appeared to be a formal dinner, Marcus's grandmother Evelyn, according to the caption, and the resemblance between that necklace and the one on the desk was undeniable down to the specific way the seventh sapphire had a tiny inclusion that caught the light differently from the others. Marcus was explaining the provenance in a voice that had gone from agitated to methodical, clearly more comfortable now that he'd moved from emotional confrontation to factual presentation, telling her that his grandmother had purchased the necklace in 1943 from a jeweler in Manhattan who'd crafted it specifically for her, that it had been passed to his mother Catherine on her wedding day that it had been stored in a safe in his parents' home in Greenwich, Connecticut, until October 15, 1992, when someone had broken in during a charity gala his parents were attending and stolen it along with several other pieces. Maya listened while her mind tried to reconcile this story with what she knew, with her memories of her grandmother wearing this necklace to Maya's first communion, to her high school graduation, to every Christmas dinner and birthday celebration, the piece that had seemed to embody everything elegant and permanent about her, Abuela's quiet dignity. She heard herself asking about the police investigation, what they'd found, whether there were suspects, and Marcus's face darkened as he explained that the case had gone cold within 6 months, that the burglars had been professionals who'd disabled the security system and left no fingerprints, that several other homes in the area had been hit the same way over a 3-year period, but no arrests were ever made. The timeline was the problem, the piece of this puzzle that Maya couldn't make fit, because if the necklace was stolen in October 1992, how had her grandmother bought it at an estate sale in Brooklyn apparently around the same time? And why would professional burglars who'd disabled security systems and avoided arrest sell their haul at an estate sale for $12? Marcus seemed to be having the same thoughts because he was frowning at his laptop screen, pulling up what appeared to be old news articles about the burglaries, and Maya could see him connecting dots in real time, his expression shifting from anger to confusion, to something that might have been understanding. She asked him what he was thinking, and after a long pause he told her that there had always been speculation that the burglaries were inside jobs, that someone with access to these homes had provided information to the thieves about security systems and valuable items, and when the families would be aware. But that theory had never been proven, and had eventually been abandoned when no likely suspects emerged. Maya felt her chest tighten because she knew where this was going, could see the shape of it forming like a storm on the horizon. She didn't want to ask the next question, but found herself asking it anyway, whether Marcus's family had employed any household staff, anyone who would have had that kind of access. His face told her the answer before he spoke, told her that yes, there had been staff. His mother had employed a housekeeper, and a cook and a part-time gardener, and the housekeeper had left their employment abruptly in November 1992, just a few weeks after the burglary, claiming a family emergency in her home country that required her immediate return. Maya's hands were shaking now as she pulled out her phone and navigated to the photos she'd been looking at. Just this morning, the old pictures her aunt had scanned and sent her, photographs from her grandmother's life that Maya had been organizing into a memorial album, and she scrolled until she found the one she was looking for, the image from 1991 that showed her grandmother in uniform standing in front of a large house, her face young and uncertain, barely in her 40s, a woman who'd immigrated from Ecuador 5 years earlier, and was working whatever job she could find to support her family. She turned the phone toward Marcus without saying anything, watched his face as he looked at the image, saw the exact moment recognition hit him like a physical blow, his mouth opening slightly, his eyes going wide, and he was reaching for the phone with a hand that trembled visibly now. The silence stretched between them for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, both of them staring at the photograph of Elena Santos standing in front of the Thornton family home in Greenwich, Connecticut, wearing a housekeeper's uniform and looking directly at the camera with an expression that was impossible to read across 3 decades of distance. Marcus set the phone down very carefully, like it was something fragile or dangerous, and when he looked up at Maya, his face had gone pale beneath his expensive tan, all the commanding presence that had probably served him well in boardrooms completely stripped away, leaving him looking lost and somehow much older. He asked in a voice barely above a whisper whether Maya's grandmother had worked for his family, and she nodded because there was no point denying what they could both see, told him that her abuela had worked for several wealthy families in Connecticut in the early 90s, that she'd never talked much about those years except to say they'd been difficult, that she'd left that work abruptly and moved back to Brooklyn, where she'd lived until her death 8 months ago. The implications hung in the air between them like smoke, neither of them willing to speak them aloud yet, because saying it would make it real, would transform Maya's beloved grandmother, from the woman who'd raised her with stories and love, and firm discipline, into something else entirely, someone who'd participated in crimes that had broken families and hearts and trust. The next hour dissolved into accusations and defenses and raised voices that brought Pierre knocking on the door twice, before Marcus waved him away with barely controlled irritation, because this conversation was spiraling into territory that neither of them had been prepared for when they'd sat down to examine a necklace, but both of them needed to navigate now, whether they wanted to or not. Marcus was pacing the small office like a caged animal, his expensive suit jacket discarded over a filing cabinet, his tie loosened, all that corporate composure completely abandoned as he tried to process what the evidence was telling him, that the woman who'd stolen from his family, who'd broken his mother's heart and violated their trust, and participated in crimes that had terrorized an entire neighborhood, had been Maya's grandmother, had been the person Maya clearly loved and mourned and held up as some kind of moral example. He kept coming back to that point, his voice getting louder each time, asking Maya how she could defend someone who'd done what Elena had obviously done, who'd betrayed people who'd employed her, and trusted her and treated her fairly, and Maya found her own voice rising to match his, because he didn't know anything about fairness or trust or what her grandmother's life had actually been like. She was standing now too, her own arms crossed defensively across her chest, telling Marcus that he had no idea what it was like to come to a new country with nothing, to work jobs that paid minimum wage while wealthy people looked through you like you were furniture, to be treated as less than human by families who thought their money made them better than the people who cleaned their houses and cooked their food and raised their children. Marcus shot back that his mother had never treated their employers poorly, that Elena had been paid well above minimum wage with benefits and respect, that there was no justification for theft, no matter what economic circumstances someone faced, and Maya laughed harshly at that, a sound with no humor in it, asking him if he really believed that, whether he truly thought his family had seen her grandmother as an equal, as someone whose dignity and struggles mattered beyond how well she folded the sheets or prepared the dinner. The words were coming faster now, both of them saying things that probably shouldn't be said. Years of class resentment and privilege and pain boiling over in Pierre's small office, and somewhere in the back of Maya's mind she knew this wasn't entirely about her grandmother or his necklace anymore, but about something bigger and older and harder to resolve. Marcus was talking about his mother now, his voice cracking slightly as he described how Catherine had wept over the stolen jewelry, how she'd felt violated and unsafe in her own home, how she'd never been quite the same after the burglary, never quite trusted people the same way. And Maya could hear the genuine grief in his voice, but she couldn't let herself sympathize too much, because if she did, then she'd have to accept what her grandmother had done, would have to reconcile the woman who'd tucked her in at night with someone who'd caused that kind of pain. She heard herself saying that maybe his mother should have paid her staff better, treated them better, seen them as people instead of servants, and Marcus's face went red as he told her she had no right to make those assumptions, no idea what his family had been like. And Maya shot back that she knew exactly what families like his were like because she'd been watching them her entire life, had been serving them at this restaurant for 18 months, had seen how they talked to service workers when they thought no one important was listening. The argument spiraled further, accusations flying back and forth like artillery fire, and at some point Pierre knocked again, his voice muffled through the door, asking if he needed to call someone, security perhaps, and Maya and Marcus both yelled no simultaneously, then looked at each other with something that might have been surprise at their sudden agreement. The moment of unity passed quickly though, replaced by Marcus demanding to know what Maya intended to do about the necklace, whether she was going to return it to its rightful owners, or whether she was going to continue benefiting from her grandmother's crimes. And Maya felt her jaw clench as she told him that her grandmother had given her that necklace with her dying breath, had made Maya promise to keep it, that it was all she had left of the woman who'd raised her, and she wasn't going to hand it over to some rich man who probably had a dozen other pieces of expensive jewelry sitting in a safe somewhere collecting dust. Marcus's expression shifted then, something hardening in his eyes as he told her that wasn't how the law worked, that stolen property remained stolen regardless of who currently possessed it, that he could call the police right now and have her arrested for possession of stolen goods. Maya felt fear spike through her anger as she realized he wasn't bluffing, that he had the power and resources to make her life incredibly difficult if he chose to. She asked him quietly if that was what he was going to do, whether he was going to have her arrested over a necklace, whether destroying her life was going to make his mother feel any better about what happened 32 years ago, and Marcus looked away, his jaw working as he struggled with something internal, some conflict between what he felt he should do and what he actually wanted to do. When he finally spoke again, his voice was lower, more controlled, telling her that he didn't want to call the police, didn't want to make this into something public and messy, but he also couldn't just walk away and pretend he hadn't seen his family's property around her, that there had to be some resolution here, some way forward that acknowledged the wrong that had been done. Maya sank back into her chair, exhausted suddenly, all the fight draining out of her as the reality of the situation settled over her like a weight, because he was rude. There had to be some resolution, and she had no idea what that resolution could possibly be, that wouldn't require her to give up the last piece of her grandmother she had left or turn her back on a woman who'd loved her unconditionally, even if that woman had done something terrible decades before Maya was. 3 days later, Maya found herself sitting in her small studio apartment in Queens with Marcus Thornton perched awkwardly on her second-hand couch, both of them surrounded by cardboard boxes that contained her grandmother's belongings, items Maya hadn't been able to bring herself to sort through since Elena's death, but that now seemed to hold the only possible answers to the questions that had consumed them both since that night at Celestine's. Marcus had called her the morning after their argument, his voice careful and formal, asking if they could meet somewhere neutral to discuss the situation, and Maya had surprised herself by suggesting he come to her apartment, that maybe they needed to understand her grandmother's story before they decided what to do about the necklace. Now they were pulling out journals and letters and receipts and photographs, creating piles on her worn coffee table, while her cat Mr. Whiskers watched them with suspicious green eyes from his perch on the windowsill. Marcus handled each item carefully, almost reverently, as if he understood that he was being given access to something private and precious, and Maya appreciated that care even though she was still angry with him, still resentful of his assumptions and his privilege and his power to turn her life upside down with a single phone call to the police. The journals were the key, thick notebooks filled with her grandmother's precise handwriting in Spanish, entries that dated back to Elena's first years in America, and Maya began translating them aloud while Marcus listened with an expression that shifted from skepticism to confusion, to something that might have been shame. Elena's words painted a picture very different from the simple story of a grateful immigrant making a better life, instead revealing a woman who'd fled Ecuador after her husband was killed in a robbery, who'd come to America alone with barely any English, and an infant daughter to support, who'd taken whatever work she could find and endured things that made Maya's stomach turn as she read them aloud. There were entries about families who'd paid her half of what they'd promised, who'd accused her of stealing when items went missing, who'd expected her to work 16-hour days for wages that barely covered rent, and Marcus's face grew darker with each revelation. But Maya kept reading because he needed to hear this, needed to understand the context that had shaped her grandmother's choices even if it didn't excuse them. Then she found the entry from August 1992, 6 weeks before the burglary, and her voice caught as she read Elena's description of watching Mrs. Thornton show off her jewelry collection to guests at a dinner party, talking about how each piece was worth more than Elena would make in 5 years of work, laughing about how fortunate they were while Elena stood invisible in the corner waiting to serve dessert. The entry grew darker from there, Elena's neat handwriting becoming more erratic as she described her desperation, how her daughter Maria was sick and needed surgery that their inadequate health insurance wouldn't cover, how Elena had been taking on extra jobs but couldn't make enough money fast enough, how she'd been approached by a man who claimed he could solve her problems if she was willing to help with something simple, just provide information about security systems and schedules, nothing more. Maya's hands were shaking as she turned the pages, reading about Elena's internal struggle, her guilt and fear warring with her desperation to save her daughter, and Marcus was leaning forward now, his earlier anger replaced by something more complicated as he listened to the story unfold. The entry from October 20th, 5 days after the burglary, was written in a hand so shaky it was barely legible, Elena describing how she'd quit the Thornton household, how she'd taken the money the man had given her, and paid for Maria's surgery, how she'd used some of the remaining money to buy back one piece of the stolen jewelry from the man, the necklace specifically, because it had reminded her of something her own mother had owned in Ecuador before poverty had forced them to sell everything. She'd paid $60 for it according to the journal entry, not 12 as she'd later told Maya, and she'd kept it hidden for years before finally wearing it in the late 90s when she felt enough time had passed that no one would recognize. Maya's voice failed completely as she read the final lines of that entry, where Elena wrote that she'd damned her soul to save her daughter's life, that she would carry that sin forever, but couldn't bring herself to regret it, because Maria was alive and thriving and that was all that mattered. Marcus was silent for a long time after Maya stopped reading, his hands clasped between his knees, his head bowed, and when he finally spoke his voice was rough with emotion, asking about Maya's mother, about Maria, and Maya explained quietly that her mother had died in a car accident when Maya was 7, that the surgery Elena had paid for had given Maria another 15 years of life, 15 years of loving her daughter, and building a career and experiencing joy before a drunk driver took that all away on a rainy Tuesday in November. The irony wasn't lost on either of them, that Elena had committed a terrible crime to save her daughter only to lose her anyway, and Maya found tears streaming down her face as she thought about the weight her grandmother must have carried, the guilt that must have haunted her every time she looked at that necklace, knowing what it represented, what she'd sacrificed to obtain it. Marcus reached over and placed his hand carefully on Maya's shoulder, a gesture of comfort that surprised them both, and when she looked up at him she saw that his eyes were wet too, that he was struggling with his own emotion, wrestling with a story that was so much more complicated than he'd anticipated. He told her that his mother had passed away 3 years ago, that Catherine had lived with the trauma of that burglary for the rest of her life, had never felt truly safe again, and Maya whispered that she was truly sorry, because she meant it even though her grandmother was gone and beyond the reach of apologies. They sat there for a while in the gathering darkness of her small apartment, neither of them turning on lights, just existing in the space between anger and understanding, between justice and mercy, two people connected by a crime committed before Maya was born but that had shaped both their lives in ways they were only beginning to comprehend. The lawyer's office in downtown Manhattan was everything Maya had expected from Marcus Thornton's world, all glass and steel and abstract art that probably cost more than her annual salary, and she felt completely out of place in her Target blazer and discount store heels as she followed Marcus through the reception area where people in expensive suits moved purposefully between offices like they were choreographing some complex corporate ballet. Marcus's attorney, Jennifer Chen, turned out to be a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who listened to their story with an expression that suggested she'd heard stranger things, but not by much. And after they'd finished explaining the situation, she'd sat back in her leather chair and asked them directly what they wanted to happen, what outcome would feel right to both of them given the impossible circumstances. Maya had expected Marcus to demand the necklace's immediate return, to insist on his legal rights and his family's claim to property that was unquestionably stolen, but instead he looked at Maya and said quietly that he wasn't sure anymore, that he'd spent the last week thinking about Elena's story and his mother's pain, and whether justice meant punishment or something more complicated. Jennifer made notes on her legal pad while Marcus explained that he wanted his mother's necklace back, wanted it returned to the family where it belonged, but that he also understood Maya's attachment to it, understood that it represented her last connection to a grandmother who'd loved her even if that grandmother had made terrible choices out of desperate circumstances. Maya felt her throat tighten as she listened to him speak, because this was more grace than she'd expected, more than she'd allowed herself to hope for after their explosive argument in Pierre's office. Jennifer was outlining options now, her voice professional and measured as she explained the legal landscape, that technically Maya could be charged with possession of stolen property even though she'd received it unknowingly, that Marcus's family could sue to recover the necklace through civil court, that the whole situation could become messy and expensive and public if they weren't careful about how they proceeded. But there were other options too, Jennifer continued, paths that didn't involve police or courts or newspaper headlines, arrangements that could satisfy both parties if they were willing to be creative and flexible about what justice looked like. She suggested that Maya could voluntarily return the necklace to the Thornton family, acknowledging their legal ownership, but that in exchange Marcus could provide compensation that recognized Maya's good faith possession and her emotional attachment to the piece, perhaps monetary compensation that would help Maya achieve financial stability her grandmother had struggled so hard to find. Maya felt herself bristle slightly at that suggestion, because it felt too much like selling her grandmother's memory, like putting a price tag on love and grief and the complicated legacy Elena had left behind, and she said as much, her voice harder than she'd intended, as she told Jennifer that this wasn't about money, that she didn't want Marcus's pity or his charitable contributions disguised as compensation. Marcus leaned forward then, his expression earnest as he told her that wasn't what he meant, that he wasn't trying to buy her off or assuage his own guilt, but that he wanted to do something that would honor both his mother's memory and Elena's complicated legacy, something that acknowledged the systemic failures that had pushed Elena to make the choices she'd made. He started describing an idea that had been forming in his mind over the past few days, a proposal that made Jennifer raise her eyebrows slightly and Maya sit up straighter in her chair, because it wasn't what either of them had expected. Marcus explained that his company owned several properties throughout New York City, including apartment buildings, and that he wanted to establish a fund in his mother's name that would provide housing assistance and job training for immigrant women in situations similar to what Elena had faced, women who were struggling to support their families in a system that often seemed designed to keep them desperate. He would fund this initiative personally, not through his company, and he wanted Maya to be involved in its administration if she was willing to help identify the women who needed assistance and ensure the program actually served the people it was meant to help, rather than becoming another empty charitable gesture that looked good in press releases, but changed nothing. Maya found herself struggling to process what he was proposing because it was so far beyond simple compensation or legal settlements. It was something that would potentially help hundreds of women over time, women who might otherwise make the same desperate choices Elena had made. She felt tears burning in her eyes again as she realized that he was trying to create something meaningful from this tragedy, something that would honor both their mothers in different ways. Jennifer was outlining the legal structure such a fund would require, talking about non-profit status and tax implications and oversight committees, and Maya only half listened because she was looking at Marcus and seeing him differently now, not as the entitled wealthy man she'd assumed he was, but as someone who was genuinely trying to do the right thing. In a situation where the right thing wasn't clear or simple, she heard herself asking what would happen to the necklace, whether she would have to surrender it immediately. And Marcus exchanged a glance with Jennifer before telling Maya that he wanted to propose something unusual, that instead of keeping the necklace locked in a safe or wearing it to social events, he wanted to donate it to a museum with a full provenance that included both his grandmother's original ownership and Elena's story, a display that would tell the truth about how objects moved through the world, about the complicated intersections of poverty and privilege, and the choices people made when systems failed them. The necklace would become educational rather than decorative, Marcus explained, a way to start conversations about inequality and immigration, and the hidden costs of wealth. And in the museum documentation, Elena's name would be included not as a criminal but as a woman who'd faced impossible circumstances and made a choice that haunted her for the rest of her life. Maya was crying openly now, not trying to hide it anymore, because this was more than she'd imagined possible, more grace and understanding than she'd thought existed in the world, and she nodded yes, even though Jennifer was already drafting notes about what would need to happen next, what legal documents would need to be signed, what processes would need to be followed. They spent another 2 hours in that conference room working through details and logistics, Jennifer's efficient competence turning their emotional agreement into practical steps and timeline. By the time Maya left, she felt exhausted, but also lighter somehow, like a weight she hadn't known she was carrying had been partially lifted. Marcus walked her to the elevator, both of them aware that they'd crossed some threshold together, that they'd moved from adversaries to something more complicated and potentially more meaningful, and before the elevator doors closed, he told her that he'd like to take her to dinner next week, not at Celestine's where she'd have to work but somewhere else, somewhere they could talk as equals, about the fund and the museum and maybe get to know each other as people, rather than representatives of different worlds. Maya found herself smiling for the first time in days as she told him yes, she'd like that, and as the elevator descended she touched the necklace one more time, knowing that in a few weeks it would no longer be hers to wear, but somehow feeling okay about that, feeling like maybe her grandmother would understand and even approve of what they were trying to build from the ashes of her old crime. 4 months later, Maya stood in the newly renovated Immigration and Labor History wing of the Museum of the City of New York, watching workers carefully position the display case that would hold the necklace, and she found herself thinking about all the unlikely turns that had brought her to this moment, all the choices and chances and coincidences that had transformed a random evening at work into something that was changing her entire life in ways she was still processing. Marcus stood beside her, reviewing the text that would accompany the display, reading aloud the words that told both Evelyn Thornton's story and Elena Santos's story, the way the necklace had passed from a wealthy woman who'd commissioned it as a symbol of prosperity to a desperate immigrant who'd bought it back from thieves with money earned from betrayal, and how that betrayal had been born from a system that valued some lives more than others, and left people like Elena with impossible choices. The museum curator, Dr. Rebecca Walsh, had worked with them for weeks to get the language right, to tell a story that was honest about the crime without being sensational, that honored both women's humanity without excusing wrongdoing or minimizing harm, and Maya thought they'd succeeded in creating something that would make people uncomfortable in productive ways, that would challenge them to think about how their own comfort might be built on others' desperation. The Elena Santos Housing and Career Fund had officially launched 6 weeks ago with an initial endowment that had made Maya's eyes water when Jennifer had shown her the paperwork, and they'd already assisted 12 women with housing deposits, job training, childcare support, and legal aid. 12 families whose trajectories had been changed by money that Marcus had pledged in his mother's name, but that Maya knew was really about Elaine, about making sure her grandmother's desperate crime led to something better for others facing similar circumstances. Maya had reduced her hours at Celestine's to part-time so she could work as the fund's community liaison, a title that felt impossibly professional, but that basically meant she spent her days meeting with immigrant women and social service organizations and landlords, trying to build bridges between worlds that usually pretended the others didn't exist. Pierre had been surprisingly supportive when she'd told him had even made a personal donation to the fund and volunteered to provide job references for any women who wanted to work in the restaurant industry, which had touched Maya more than she'd expected because it suggested that maybe some people in that world actually cared about changing things rather than just maintaining their own comfortable positions. Marcus and Maya had fallen into an unlikely friendship over those months, meeting weekly for coffee to discuss the fund's operations, but also just to talk, to share stories about their families and their very different childhoods, and their perspectives on the complicated world they were both trying to navigate. She'd learned that his success hadn't come easily despite his privileged background, that he'd rebuilt his father's failing real estate company from near bankruptcy, that he'd struggled with depression after his divorce and found meaning again through his daughter Sophie, who was apparently majoring in social justice studies at Columbia, and was thrilled about the fund in a way that made Marcus both proud and slightly embarrassed about his own previous blindness to these issues. He'd learnt about Maya's childhood with Elena, about her mother's death, and her grandmother's fierce determination to keep Maya in school and away from the streets, about Maya's abandoned dreams of becoming a teacher before student debt and financial reality had pushed her into restaurant work, and he'd quietly arranged for the fund to include scholarship money for community college, because he was subtle like that, never making a big deal about his generosity but just making things happen in ways that changed lives. Dr. Walsh was calling them over now to review the final placement of the photographs that would surround the necklace display. Images of Evelyn Thornton at various society events wearing the piece, then the police report from the burglary, then photographs Maya had provided of Elena in her later years, her face lined with age and secrets, her eyes still kind despite everything she'd carried. There was also going to be an interactive component where museum visitors could hear audio recordings of people discussing their own experiences with poverty and crime and moral compromise, stories collected from immigrant communities throughout New York City, voices that rarely got heard in spaces like museums that traditionally catered to people who looked more like the Thorntons than the Santos. Maya had participated in collecting those stories, had sat in community centers and churches and people's homes listening to confessions and regrets and justifications, and she'd been struck by how common Elena's experience was, how many people lived with the weight of choices they'd made in desperation, how the line between victim and perpetrator was often blurrier than anyone wanted to admit. The display would open to the public in 2 weeks, Dr. Walsh explained, and there would be a small private reception the night before for donors and community partners, and people who'd contributed to making this happen, and Maya was expected to say a few words about her grandmother and the fund, which terrified her because public speaking had never been her strength, but also felt important because Elena's voice deserved to be heard, deserved to be part of this conversation about who got to tell stories and how we understood crime and punishment and redemption. Marcus had offered to have his company's PR team help her write remarks, but Maya had declined, had told him this needed to be in her own words even if they weren't polished or professional, and he'd understood that in the way he'd come to understand a lot of things over these months, his initial certainty about right and wrong having been complicated by proximity to lives very different from his own. They finished reviewing the display setup and walked out of the museum together into the bright afternoon sunlight, and Marcus suggested they grab lunch at a Dominican restaurant in Washington Heights that Maya had mentioned weeks ago, the kind of place he'd never been before but that had become part of their routine, these small border crossings between their worlds that felt like practice for something bigger. As they walked toward the subway, Maya found herself thinking about her grandmother, about whether Elena would be proud or horrified by what had come from that night 32 years ago, when she'd made a choice that had rippled forward through time to create this moment, this unlikely partnership, this attempt to build something better, from something broken, and Maya decided that Elena would probably feel both pride and horror simultaneously, because that was the truth of complicated life, that we contained multitudes and contradictions, and never fit neatly into the categories of saint or sinner that people wanted to assign. The gallery was packed with a more diverse crowd than Maya suspected had ever gathered in this museum space. Wealthy donors in expensive suits standing next to women from the Bronx and Queens who'd received assistance from the fund, city officials mixing with community organizers, Sophia Thornton talking animatedly with Maya's Aunt Carmen about social justice theory, while Pierre stood nearby looking simultaneously proud and uncomfortable in his formal attire. The necklace sat in its illuminated case at the center of the room, the sapphires catching the carefully positioned lights in a way that made them seem to glow from within, and Maya couldn't stop looking at it, couldn't stop thinking about all the hands it had passed through, all the lives it had touched, all the weight it carried beyond its physical presence. Dr. Walsh was introducing her now, telling the gathered crowd about Maya's role in making this exhibition possible, about her courage in sharing her grandmother's story, despite knowing how that story complicated easy narratives about innocence and guilt, and Maya felt her heart hammering as she stepped up to the small podium they'd set up near the display case, her prepared remarks suddenly feeling inadequate for the moment. She looked out at the faces watching her, at Marcus standing off to the side with an expression of encouragement, at her aunt dabbing her eyes with a tissue, at the dozen women from the fund who'd come to support her, and she understood that this wasn't just about her grandmother anymore, but about all the invisible people whose stories never got told in places like this, whose choices were judged without context, whose humanity was reduced to statistics in police reports and news articles about urban crime. Maya began speaking, her voice shaky at first, but growing stronger as she told Elena's story, not the sanitized version but the full truth of a woman who'd fled violence in her home country, who'd worked jobs that broke her body and spirit, who'd been underpaid and disrespected and treated as disposable by people who benefited from her labor, and who'd finally made a choice that she'd regretted for the rest of her life, but that had saved her daughter's life, when the legal system and medical establishment had failed to provide alternatives. She talked about finding the journal, about reading her grandmother's anguished words, about damning her soul, about realizing that Elena had carried the weight of that crime every single day for 32 years, had looked at that necklace and seen both her daughter's salvation and her own moral failure, had eventually given it to Maya not because she didn't know it was stolen, but because she wanted someone she loved to have something beautiful, even though it had come from something terrible. The room was completely silent now, everyone listening with an intensity that Maya could feel pressing against her skin, and she saw tears on faces throughout the crowd, saw people who'd probably never thought about the circumstances that pushed people toward crime, suddenly confronting the uncomfortable reality that desperation wasn't an excuse, but it was context, that judgment was easy from positions of comfort and security, but much harder when you actually understood what it felt like to watch your child suffer because you couldn't afford medical care. She talked about Marcus then, about his initial anger and his eventual growth, how he could have destroyed her life with a phone call to police, but instead had chosen to try building something that would address the root causes that had pushed Elena toward crime in the first place. And as she spoke, she saw him looking down at his shoes with what might have been embarrassment because he didn't like being praised, preferred to let his actions speak rather than receiving recognition for basic human decency. Maya's voice cracked as she talked about the women they'd already helped, about the ones they hoped to help in the future, and she said that while nothing could undo the harm Elena had caused to the Thornton family, nothing could give Marcus's mother back her sense of security, or return those years she'd lived in fear. Maybe they could prevent other Elenas from facing those same impossible choices. Maybe they could build a world where people didn't have to choose between their morals and their children's lives. She finished by saying that this necklace represented failure on multiple levels, the failure of systems that left people like Elena without options, the failure of criminal justice to address root causes, the failure of wealthy communities to see the humanity in the people who served them, but that it also represented possibility now, the possibility that we could learn from these failures and do better, that we could create spaces where complicated truths got told, and where multiple things could be true simultaneously, where Elena could be both a criminal and a victim, where the Thorntons could be both harmed and privileged, where jewelry could be simultaneously precious and problematic. When she stepped away from the podium, the applause started slowly, then built to something overwhelming, people standing and clapping and some calling out encouragement in Spanish and English. And Maya felt tears streaming down her face as she looked at that necklace one final time, saying goodbye to it, but also somehow feeling like she was honoring her grandmother more fully than she ever could have, by simply keeping it locked away in a jewelry box. Marcus was suddenly beside her, his hand on her shoulder in that gesture that had become familiar between them, and he leaned close to tell her that was perfect. that his mother would have appreciated hearing Elena's story told with such honesty and compassion, and Maya nodded because she couldn't speak yet, couldn't trust her voice not to break completely. The reception continued around them, people examining the display and reading the text and listening to the audio stories, conversations starting between strangers from different worlds, and Doc Walsh was already talking about expanding the exhibition, about creating a whole section on immigration and labor rights and the hidden costs of American prosperity, about how this single necklace had opened up possibilities for much larger conversations about who got to tell history and whose stories mattered. Sophia appeared with champagne, declaring this the coolest thing her dad had ever done, and insisting on selfies with Maya and the necklace display. And Maya found herself laughing despite her tears, found herself thinking that maybe this was what healing looked like, not forgetting or excusing but remembering fully and trying to build something better from the wreckage of the past. Later that night, after most people had left and the museum staff were starting to clean up, Maya stood alone in front of the display one last time, her hand pressed against the glass case, and she whispered to her grandmother that she understood now, understood the impossible weight Elena had carried, understood that love sometimes pushed people toward actions they never imagined themselves capable of, and that while she couldn't absolve her grandmother's crime, she could honor the fullness of her humanity, could make sure that Elena's story served a purpose beyond just being a cautionary tale about the consequences of desperation. The necklace glowed in its case, beautiful and terrible and complicated, exactly like the woman who'd worn it for 30 years, exactly like the world they all lived in, and were trying in their imperfect ways to make marginally better, one story and one person and one act of grace at a time. 6 months after the exhibition opened, Maya sat in a community center in Jackson Heights, conducting her third intake interview of the morning, listening to a Guatemalan woman named Rosa describe her current situation, her 3 children, her 2 jobs that still didn't add up to enough money for rent and groceries, her fears about deportation, and her dreams of nursing school that seemed impossibly far away given her circumstances. Maya took notes while Rosa talked, asking questions that had become routine over the past months, but that still felt important, because each woman's story was unique, even when the broader patterns were depressingly similar, and she found herself thinking about her grandmother constantly during these interviews, seeing Elena in every tired face, in every expression of determination mixed with desperation, in every description of the impossible mathematics of poverty, where the numbers never quite added up, no matter how hard you worked or how many hours you sacrificed. The fund had grown beyond what any of them had initially imagined, with additional donors coming forward after the publicity around the museum exhibition, and they'd been able to help 43 families so far with everything from housing deposits to medical bills, to job training to immigration legal fees, 43 sets of circumstances that might have pushed people toward the same choices Elena had made, but that had instead been redirected towards stability and hope. Marcus had hired 2 additional staff members to help Maya manage the growing program, including a bilingual social worker named Patricia, who had her own immigration story and understood the systems they were trying to navigate from the inside. And together they'd developed partnerships with landlords and employers and educational institutions throughout the city, slowly building a network that could catch people before they fell through the cracks that had swallowed so many. Rosa was crying now as she described her oldest daughter's asthma and how the girl sometimes couldn't breathe properly because Rosa couldn't afford the medication that wasn't covered by their minimal insurance. And Maya felt that familiar rage rising in her chest, the anger at systems that forced people to choose between basic necessities, that created artificial scarcity in a city overflowing with wealth, that treated human suffering as an acceptable cost of maintaining economic hierarchies that benefited so few. She told Rosa about the fund's healthcare assistance program, about how they could help with medication costs, and potentially connect her daughter with a clinic that offered free asthma management services, and watched Rosa's face transform as she realized this wasn't a theoretical possibility, but actual help being offered right now. No waiting list, no bureaucratic maze to navigate, just support from people who understood and wanted to help. These moments never got old for Maya. These instances where she could be the person she wished had existed for her grandmother, where she could intervene in a story before it went wrong, before desperation pushed someone past the point of return, and she knew that Marcus felt similarly even though he experienced it differently. From his position of writing checks and making connections and leveraging his privilege in ways that actually helped rather than just maintaining the status quo, they had dinner together every week, sometimes joined by Sophia, who was doing an internship with the fund as part of her social justice degree, and these evenings had become a space where they processed the work, shared the stories that stuck with them, challenged each other's assumptions and blind spots. And Maya had come to value Marcus's perspective, even when she disagreed with it, had come to see him as a genuine partner in this work rather than just a wealthy benefactor doing charitable penance. The museum exhibition had attracted national attention, with articles in the New York Times and NPR pieces, and even a documentary filmmaker asking about making a short film about Elena's story and the fund that had emerged from it. And Maya had been shocked by how many people reached out to share similar stories, their own family histories of impossible choices and moral compromises, their own relatives who'd done things they weren't proud of because survival sometimes required it. The comments sections of those articles were predictably divided, some people praising the nuanced approach while others insisted that crime was crime regardless of circumstances, that Elena should have found another way, that celebrating her story somehow excused theft and violated property rights. And Maya had learned to mostly ignore those voices, because they fundamentally didn't understand what desperation felt like, couldn't imagine a world where all the legal options had been exhausted, and closed doors were the only response to legitimate needs. Rosa was filling out paperwork now, her hands shaking slightly as she wrote down information that Maya would use to start processing assistance for her family, and Maya found herself thinking about trajectory, about how Rosa's daughter might grow up to remember her mother as someone who'd worked hard and received help when she needed it, rather than someone who'd been pushed toward crime and punishment. How that difference in narrative could ripple forward through generations, changing not just individual lives but the stories families told about themselves and their place in the world. Patricia appeared in the doorway to let Maya know her next appointment had arrived, and as Rosa gathered her papers and thanked Maya with an intensity that made Maya uncomfortable because she was just doing work that should have been done by properly funded social services, she thought about the strange path that had led her here, from that night at Celestine's when Marcus had recognized the necklace, to this moment where she was sitting in a community center actively intervening in stories that might otherwise end tragically. She'd left Celestine's completely 3 months ago, her last shift marked by Pierre presenting her with a bottle of expensive wine and a card signed by the entire staff, many of whom had made donations to the fund, despite their own financial struggles. And while she sometimes missed the rhythm of restaurant work, the immediate feedback of a job well done and a tip left on the table, she couldn't imagine going back to that life now that she'd seen what was possible when people with resources actually paid attention to the systems that produced inequality. Marcus called later that afternoon while Maya was writing up her intake notes, his voice excited as he told her about a real estate developer he'd just had lunch with, who was interested in dedicating several units in a new building to fund recipients at below market rate, and they spent 20 minutes discussing logistics and possibilities, their conversation flowing with the ease of people who'd learned each other's communication styles and values, who trusted each other to follow through and care about outcomes beyond their own benefit. Sophia had started a student organization at Columbia, focused on immigrant rights, and had recruited a dozen classmates to volunteer with the fund. These young people with their idealism and energy and conviction that the world could be different if people just paid attention and acted accordingly. And while Maya sometimes found their optimism naive, she also envied it, wished she could believe as fully as they did that change was possible on a scale that mattered. But maybe that was the work, she thought as she finished her notes and prepared for her next appointment. Maybe the point wasn't to believe in massive systemic transformation but to show up every day and do the small interventions that added up over time, to help one Rosa, and then another, and another, until gradually the network of support became strong enough to hold more people, to catch more families before they fell, to create alternatives to the desperate choices that had defined her grandmother's life and so many others like her. The rooftop garden of Marcus's building had become their unofficial meeting place for important conversations, the space where they'd discussed expanding the fund, and where Maya had told him about being accepted into a social work master's program, and where they'd shared the news that the museum wanted to make the necklace exhibition permanent, and now they sat there watching the sun set over Manhattan, while traffic sounds drifted up from the streets below, like distant music. It had been 18 months since that night at Celestine's, when Marcus had walked in and seen his family's necklace around Maya's neck. 18 months of transformation and revelation and hard work that had changed both their lives in ways neither could have predicted, and now they were meeting to discuss the next phase, the point where the fund either grew into something sustainable or remained a well-intentioned but ultimately limited project. Marcus had the financial projections spread across the bench between them, numbers that showed what would be possible if they could secure additional major donors and foundation grants, and Maya was simultaneously excited and terrified by the scale of what he was proposing, the idea that they could help not just dozens but eventually hundreds of families, that they could become a model for other cities, that they could actually make a measurable difference in the systems that produced inequality and desperation. She thought about her grandmother often in these moments, wondered what Elena would make of all this, whether she would see it as redemption or just a privileged man's guilt, translated into action, and Maya had come to believe that it was probably both, that Marcus's involvement was motivated by genuine care and also by a need to resolve his own complicated feelings about his family's wealth and his mother's suffering, and that was okay because motivation mattered less than outcome, less than the actual families being helped, and the actual choices being made and necessary. The museum exhibition had evolved beyond just displaying the necklace to include interactive elements where visitors could record their own stories about moral compromise and economic desperation, and the archive was growing daily, with testimonies from people across the city, sharing experiences they'd never told anyone, secrets they'd carried about theft or fraud or ethical violations they'd committed when circumstances left them no other choice. Dr. Walsh had told Maya that the exhibition was challenging visitors in productive ways, forcing them to confront their own assumptions about crime and poverty, and several universities were using it as a teaching tool for courses on immigration, criminal justice and economic inequality. Sophia had convinced her father to let her take a gap year after graduation to work with the fund full-time, and while Marcus had initially resisted the idea of his daughter dedicating herself to non-profit work when she could be pursuing more lucrative options, he'd eventually recognized that she'd inherited his drive and determination but was directing it toward different goals than the ones he'd prioritized at her age. Maya and Sophia had become genuine friends despite their different backgrounds, finding common ground in their shared frustration with systems that perpetuated suffering and their belief that individual action mattered even when structural change seemed impossibly distant. The sun was touching the horizon now, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that made the city look briefly beautiful in a way that was easy to forget when you were down in the streets dealing with the daily reality of urban life. And Marcus was talking about legacy, about what he wanted to leave behind when he eventually died, about how building this fund with Maya had given him a sense of purpose that his successful real estate career never had. Maya listened and found herself thinking about different kinds of legacy, about how Elena's crime had somehow transformed into something that was helping others avoid similar choices, about how the necklace that had caused so much pain had become a tool for education and conversation, about how the worst things people did could sometimes plant seeds that grew into better outcomes even though that didn't excuse the original harm or erase the suffering caused. She told Marcus about a conversation she'd had with Rosa last week, how Rosa's daughter's asthma was under control now, thanks to the medication assistance, how Rosa had started nursing school part-time with help from the fund's educational support, how Rosa had told Maya that she felt like she could breathe for the first time since coming to America, like maybe she didn't have to be desperate anymore, like maybe there was a path forward that didn't require her to compromise her values or betray anyone's trust. Marcus smiled at that, his eyes crinkling in a way that made him look younger and less burdened, and he said that was exactly what they were trying to build, a world where people like Rosa and Elena didn't have to make those impossible choices, where the system caught them before they fell, and Maya nodded but also said they needed to be realistic about scale, that the fund was a band-aid on a wound that required surgery, that real change meant policy shifts and wealth redistribution and fundamental restructuring of how America treated its most vulnerable residents. He agreed but pointed out that band-aids still served a purpose while you were working towards surgery, that they couldn't let the impossibility of perfect solutions prevent them from implementing imperfect but helpful intervention. And Maya acknowledged he was right, even though it frustrated her that such interventions were necessary in the first place. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sky darken and the city lights begin to twinkle like earthbound stars. And Maya felt grateful for this unlikely partnership, for the way a necklace had connected them across divides that usually remained unbridged, for the way Marcus had been willing to learn and change, and use his privilege in ways that actually mattered. She'd learned from him too, had come to understand that wealthy people weren't monolithic, that some of them genuinely wanted to do better but didn't know how, that creating change required building coalitions across class lines rather than just criticizing from the outside. And while she still believed the system was fundamentally broken, she'd also seen what was possible when people with resources and people with proximity to struggle actually listened to each other and worked together. Marcus was closing the folder now, the projections and plans tucked away for their next board meeting, and he asked Maya if she wanted to grab dinner, maybe at that Ethiopian place in Harlem she'd mentioned last month. And she said yes, because these dinners had become rich spaces where they connected as friends rather than just colleagues, where they talked about their lives and families and fears and dreams in ways that transcended the work that had brought them together. As they stood and headed toward the elevator, Maya found herself thinking about trajectories again, about how one moment of recognition in a restaurant had spiraled out into all of this, into a fund and an exhibition, and changed lives and new relationships, into a story that was still being written and would continue beyond both of them, into a legacy that honored both the complicated woman who'd raised her and the woman who'd been harmed by Elena's choices, into something that was bigger than any individual guilt or grief or need for redemption. The elevator arrived and they stepped in, their reflection visible in the polished doors, a wealthy CEO and a former waitress who'd somehow become partners in trying to build something better, and Maya smiled at the image because it was so unlikely, so improbable, completely not what either of them had planned, and yet here they were, connected by a sapphire necklace, and a shared belief that maybe, just maybe, they could make a small corner of the world marginally less brutal for people who deserved better than the hands they'd been dealt.